Chronicles of Christ, the feeding of the 5,000. Usually in this series I've got the opposite problem. Usually I'm scraping one witness here, a fragment there, a long silence to squint at. Today, for once, I'm drowning in testimony, and it turns out that's its own kind of problem. The event in front of us is the single best attested miracle in the entire life of Jesus. It is the only one, the resurrection accepted, that all four Gospels stop and tell. Matthew tells it, Mark tells it, Luke tells it, John tells it, and they don't just each tell it, they agree right down to the arithmetic on numbers so specific you could print them on a receipt. 5 loaves, 2 fish, 5,000 men, 12 baskets of leftovers. 4 witnesses, 4 independent pens, 1 impossible afternoon on a hillside by the Sea of Galilee, and the exact same 5 numbers in every single hand. So this chronicle asks a different question than most. Not with so little evidence, what can we say? But with this much evidence, 4 witnesses locked in step, what do we do with the fact that the thing they're all reporting cannot happen? Because let's be clear about what's on the table. This is not a parable. 4 sober sources insist that one evening a few loaves and a couple of dried fish became dinner for a small town with more food left at the end than they started with. That's the claim. 4 times over in the same numbers. Here's where we're going so you can test me as we walk. We'll look hard at that eerie 4-way agreement. We'll deal honestly with the comfortable sermon you have almost certainly heard, the one where nobody's lunch actually multiplies, and give it a fair hearing before we give it a fair burial. We'll find out what that crowd of thousands thought it was watching, which turns out to be far more dangerous than what a nice meal. We'll follow the story into the strangest sermon Jesus ever preached, the one that emptied the room, and we'll end where the very first Christians ended, painting loaves and fish on the walls of their tombs. Let's set the table. 4 witnesses, 1 basket. Start with the agreement because it really is striking. Lay the 4 accounts side by side and the skeleton is identical in every one. A huge crowd follows Jesus out to a lonely place. Evening comes, the people are hungry, the disciples want to send them all away to fend for themselves. Jesus says in effect, you feed them. They sputter, there's nothing here but 5 loaves and 2 fish. He has the people sit down, he takes the bread, blesses it, breaks it, gives it out. Everyone eats, everyone is full. And they gather up the scraps, 12 baskets. Now 4 people telling the same story will normally drift on the numbers. One remembers 3, another 4, a third says a few. That's how honest memory actually works. Instead, you've got 4 sources locking onto the identical count, 5, 2, 5,012, which tells you this event got fixed in the tradition early and hard, worn smooth by retelling before any of these 4 ever picked up a pen. And here's the detail I most want you to catch, because it'll ring like a bell all the way through this series. Watch what Jesus does with the bread. He took it, he blessed it, he broke it, he gave it. Hold those 4 verbs, because when we reach the Last Supper, a different night, an upper room, a table of betrayal, you will hear the very same 4 verbs in the very same order: took, blessed, broke, gave. Mark uses word-for-word identical Greek in both scenes. Whatever else this hillside supper was, it was already shaped like communion, years before the bread of the Last Supper was ever broken. The crowd on the grass was at church and didn't know it. And around that shared skeleton, each witness hangs his own remembered details, the fingerprints that prove 4 hands, not one. Mark, always the most vivid, remembers the green grass they sat on, the kind of small thing only an eyewitness bothers to keep, remembers them seated in groups of hundreds and 50s, and gives us the ache underneath the wonder. Jesus looked at that crowd and saw sheep without a shepherd. Luke sets it near Bethsaida. Matthew quietly expands the head count, 5,000 men besides women and children, so the famous 5,000 is only the men, the real crowd ran well past it. And John keeps the human particulars, the others dropped. Philip doing the panicked arithmetic, Andrew finding the one person in that whole multitude who thought to pack a lunch, a boy with 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish, and the extraordinary thing the crowd tried to do afterward, which we'll come to because it changes everything. I owe you one honest seam because this book doesn't iron them flat. Luke says the feeding happened near Bethsaida. Mark says that right after it, Jesus sent the disciples off by boat toward Bethsaida, which is a neat trick if you're already there. Commentators patch it with a theory of 2 towns of the same name on opposite shores, and maybe they're right, but I'd rather you saw the wrinkle than have me hide it. 4 witnesses this closely agreed, with one real geographical snag between 2 of them, is precisely what genuine testimony looks like. Forgers tidy up, witnesses leave seams. And one more fact that matters more than it looks. This is not the only time Jesus does this. There's a second feeding, 4,000 that time, with 7 loaves in Mark and Matthew. Skeptics have long said the 2 are really one story accidentally doubled, but the texts fight back in a detail nobody would invent. The 2 miracles use different words for basket. The 5,000's leftovers go into 12 kophanoi, small hand baskets. The 4,000's go into 7 spirides, big provision hampers, the kind of basket a grown man could be lowered from a city wall in. And later, when Jesus is scolding his slow disciples, he recalls both miracles by their own separate numbers, the 5 loaves for the 5,000, the 7 for the 4,000. The tradition didn't blur two events into one. It held them apart with two different baskets on purpose. So, four witnesses, one basket of agreed-upon facts. Which is exactly why the next thing had to be invented, because four agreeing witnesses to an impossibility make people deeply uncomfortable, and there's a very old, very kindly sermon designed to make the discomfort go away. The sermon you have heard. If you spent any real time in pews, you have almost certainly heard this miracle gently explained away by a well-meaning preacher. It goes like this. The real miracle wasn't that bread multiplied, it's that a selfish crowd learned to share. See, the argument runs, thousands of people wouldn't wander into the countryside with no food. They had provisions tucked away in their cloaks, hoarded, each keeping his own. And when the little boy shyly offered up his lunch and Jesus blessed it and started giving it away, the crowd was shamed into generosity. Everyone quietly brought out what they'd been hiding, and there was plenty for all. The miracle on this reading is a miracle of the human heart. Isn't that lovely? Isn't that so much easier to believe? I want to treat this fairly because it's preached by good people with good motives, and because the impulse behind it, that generosity is holy, is entirely true. So let me give it its due and then tell you honestly why it won't survive contact with the evidence. Its due, sharing genuinely is a kind of miracle. The instinct is sound, and this reading has a long and respectable pedigree. It didn't come from nowhere. It was worked out carefully 2 centuries ago by a German scholar named Paulus, one of a whole school of thinkers who set out to keep the gospel stories while quietly removing the impossible parts, to find behind every miracle something perfectly natural that got remembered as wonderful. An honest project in its way, the trouble is what it costs. And here's the fatal problem, and it's dead simple. The story does not say that. Not one of the 4 accounts mentions hidden provisions. Not one mentions a crowd shamed into sharing. Not one so much as hints that anyone but the boy had food. That entire touching scene, the cloaks, the hoarding, the change of heart, is not in the text. It has been added by people who found the plain text hard to swallow, which is exactly the move this whole enterprise exists to catch, no matter how kindly it's made. And worse than what the sharing reading adds is what it cannot explain, the leftovers, 12 baskets. If the miracle is just that everyone shared what they secretly had, you get a nice even meal. You do not get 12 baskets more than you started with. You cannot share your way into a surplus. The whole point the witnesses labor to make, 5 loaves in, a feast plus 12 hampers out, is a story about something being multiplied, not merely passed around. The surplus is the tell. The gospel writers put those 12 baskets there precisely so nobody could round the miracle down to good table manners. So I'll be plain about it. The sharing sermon is not what the witnesses report. It's a modern comfort laid gently over an ancient claim the modern world finds embarrassing. You are perfectly free to disbelieve the multiplication. That's between you and your own honest mind, and I'll think none the less of you for it. What you're not free to do is pretend the text says something it doesn't. The 4 witnesses did not report a potluck. They reported a wonder, and they built 12 baskets of evidence into it so no one could tidy it away. Believe them or don't, but hear what they actually said first. Which brings us to the real question, the one the comfortable sermon was invented to dodge. Not did the bread multiply, but what did 5,000 men think they were seeing? Because their answer very nearly started a war. What the crowd was really thinking. To get what happened on that hillside, you have to stop being a modern person for a minute and become a first-century Galilean Jew, hungry, occupied by Rome, and soaked to the marrow in a set of ancient stories you'd known by heart since you were 5. Because when that person watched bread multiply in a wilderness, he did not think clever trick. He thought, it's happening, it's finally happening. And to see why, you have to open the books that crowd carried in its bones. Book 1, Elisha. Centuries earlier, the prophet Elisha had been handed 20 barley loaves and told to feed 100 men. His servant scoffed, "How can I set this before 100 men?" And Elisha said, "Give it to the people and let them eat, for thus says the Lord, they shall eat and have some left over." And they did. Now hold that up beside our story and watch John especially wink at you. Of all 4 witnesses, John alone bothers to specify that the boy's loaves were barley, Elisha's exact bread. John is pointing. He's saying, you remember Elisha, 20 loaves, 100 men, some left over. Here's 5 loaves, 5,000 men, and 12 baskets left over. Whoever this is, he's not a prophet like Elisha. He's immeasurably more. Book 2, the manna. Every Jew on that hill knew that when their ancestors were starving in the wilderness, God rained down bread from heaven, manna, the mystery bread. What is it? And fed the whole nation in the desert. And here they all were in a wilderness being fed bread that came from almost nothing. The setting wasn't incidental. It was a quotation. This looked like manna. This looked like a new Exodus with a new Moses handing out the bread. Book 3, the shepherd and the feast. Remember Mark's aching line, Jesus saw them as sheep without a shepherd. That phrase is lifted straight out of the Old Testament, and it comes with a promise attached that God himself would one day come to shepherd his scattered people. And what does the shepherd do in the 23rd Psalm? He makes them lie down in green pastures. There's Mark's green grass, and he prepares a table. And the prophets had promised that when God's kingdom finally arrived, it would come as a banquet. The Lord of hosts will make for all peoples a feast of rich food. Some Jews of that era even taught that in the age of the Messiah, the manna itself would come back. Now stand back on that grass and add it up the way they did. Wilderness, bread from nothing, green pastures, a shepherd, a feast of abundance with baskets to spare. Every single box on the messianic checklist ticked in one meal. So no wonder, and here's John's bombshell, no wonder the crowd's very next move was to try to seize Jesus and make him king by force. John says it flat out, they meant to crown him on the spot. And you can see exactly why. They'd just been fed the way the prophets swore the Messiah's people would be fed, and a Messiah to them was a king, the man who'd throw off Rome and feed the nation forever. And look again at who was on that hill. Mark says 5,000 men, the word for adult males specifically, and Jesus had them sit down in groups of hundreds and fifties, which is not how you organize a picnic. It is how the book of Exodus organizes an army on the march, in units of hundreds and fifties. For one electric moment, that hillside wasn't a congregation, it was a muster. 5,000 fighting-age men, fed by a wonder worker, ready to make him king and march on Rome behind him. And what did Jesus do with the crown they were holding out to him? He ran. John says he saw they were about to take him by force, and he withdrew alone up the mountain. The most popular he would ever be, the single moment the crowd was ready to make him exactly the kind of Messiah they wanted, and he turned and walked away from it, because the bread they wanted him to be king of was not the bread he'd come to give. And when he tried the very next day to tell them what bread he actually meant, that's when the crowd of thousands became a handful. The bread that emptied the room. This is the part the flannel graphs leave out, and it may be the most important part of all, because it's where the crowd that wanted to crown him abandons him instead and over bread. The morning after the feeding, John says, the crowd comes hunting for Jesus. They want more. They found a man who makes lunch out of nothing and who wouldn't follow that. And Jesus bluntly calls them on it. You're not looking for me because you understood a sign, he says. You're looking for me because you ate your fill. You want the baker. And then he preaches the sermon that empties the room. Don't work for the bread that spoils, he tells them. I am the true bread. The manna your fathers ate in the wilderness, they ate it and they still died. I am the bread that came down from heaven. Whoever eats this bread lives forever. I am the bread of life. The crowd doesn't like where this is heading, and they like even less where it goes next, because Jesus pushes the image straight past the point of comfort, past the point of decency. The bread I will give, he says, is my flesh. Unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. To a people for whom blood was the single most forbidden thing at any table, this was very nearly obscene. How can this man give us his flesh to eat? They demand, and you can hear the revulsion in it, and John records the result in one of the saddest sentences in the Gospels. His own followers said, "This is a hard saying, who can listen to it?" And from that time many of his disciples turned back and no longer walked with him. Sit with the whole arc of it, because it's the truest thing in this chronicle. Yesterday, 5,000 men so thrilled with the bread king that they wanted to crown him by force. Today, a synagogue emptying out, disciples walking home because he told them the only bread he'd finally give them was himself broken. The crowd wanted a Messiah who'd fill their bellies and beat their enemies. Jesus offered a Messiah who would be bread taken, blessed, broken, and given away, and most of them wanted no part of it. The miracle of abundance and the mass desertion are the same story. The hillside is where they found out he could give them anything, and the synagogue is where they found out what he actually meant to give, and it was not what they came for. There's a whole theology folded into that flesh and blood language, whether he meant it plainly as the bread and cup of communion or spiritually as receiving him by faith. Christians have divided over that for 500 years, and I'm not about to settle in one page what the church hasn't settled in 50 decades. But notice at least that the four verbs from the hillside are already here, straining toward the upper room, the bread of life given. He fed 5,000 as a sign, and then told them the sign was pointing at his own body. They wanted the loaves. He was offering the baker broken, and most of them left. The first thing they painted. Here's how I know this meal meant more to the people who came after than almost anything else. I can show you what they drew. Go down into the catacombs beneath Rome, the burial tunnels where the earliest Christians laid their dead, in the 2nd and 3rd centuries while the faith was still illegal and hidden, and look at the very first Christian pictures anyone ever made back before there was much Christian art at all. You find a small handful of images repeated over and over on those tomb walls. The Good Shepherd, the fish, and loaves and fishes, a basket of bread with fish beside it. Among the very first things believers chose to paint over the bones of their dead, before they'd even settled how to depict Christ himself, was this meal. In the catacomb of Calixtus, there's a 3rd century image of loaves and fish that the guidebooks label simply a symbol of the Eucharist. They painted this hillside supper onto their graves because it was, to them, the promise that God's people would be fed here at the Lord's table, and fed again at the great banquet on the far side of death. Loaves and fishes were how the first Christians said, over their dead, he will not let us go hungry. The great teachers read the meal the same way, as a sign stuffed with meaning. Augustine, preaching on it, said that because Christ is the Word of God, even the act of the Word is a word to us, the miracle is a sentence God speaks in deeds. And then Augustine does the thing the old preachers love to do and reads the very loaves as scripture. Why 5 loaves? Because he says they're the 5 books of Moses, the law, and rightly are they barley, the humbler grain, because the law hides its sweet kernel inside a coarse husk. Why 12 baskets of leftovers? Because the fragments too rich for the crowd to take in were gathered up and handed to the 12 apostles to feed the church down the centuries. You may find that fanciful, I have to myself, but feel what's underneath it. The conviction that this meal was not a one-afternoon marvel but a permanent provision, still being handed out, basket by basket, at every table where bread is broken in his name. Which is right where the oldest Christian prayer we possess lands, too. In a little book called The Didache, written while some who'd actually seen Jesus may still have been alive, there's a table grace that takes the leftover fragments and turns them into a hope for the whole church. As this broken bread was scattered over the hills and was gathered together and became one, so let your church be gathered together from the ends of the earth into your kingdom. The 12 baskets of scraps had already become a prayer, that the God who could gather a hillside's worth of fragments and lose none of them could gather his scattered people the same way and lose none of them either. Gather up the fragments. Gather it up then, and this time, fittingly, there's a great deal to gather, with baskets to spare. What we can say with rare confidence, something happened on that hillside that 4 independent witnesses could not stop telling in identical numbers for the rest of the first century, a public event in front of thousands that fixed itself in the tradition so early and so hard that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all report the same 5 loaves and the same 12 baskets. Of all the wonders in the Gospels, this is the one with the fullest testimony. You may decide the multiplication is more than you can believe, but you cannot say it was whispered by one late source in a corner. It was shouted 4 times over from the very start. What the witnesses will not let us do is make it comfortable. Not the sharing sermon which the leftover baskets refuse. Not the reduction to a nice moral which the crowd's lunge for a crown refuses. Not a tidy ending which the emptied synagogue refuses. They hand us a genuinely hard thing, bread from almost nothing, a Messiah who fled the throne it earned him, and a hard saying that thinned his thousands down to 12, and they refuse to round a single corner of it off. And what they hand us to keep is the thing the first Christians painted on their graves and prayed over their bread, that he feeds people. That the same hands that took and blessed and broke and gave on the grass would take and bless and break and give in an upper room and go on giving at 10,000 tables since and lose nothing. Not a fragment, not a person. The crowd wanted a king who'd fill their bellies. What they were offered instead, what we are still offered, was better and far harder, a Lord who makes himself the meal. So go and be fed and gather up the fragments that nothing be lost. There's more here than we started with. There always is, that's rather the point.